Hello and welcome now to this part of Lernraum. We are going to have a look at the more practical perspectives on working more equitable and more diverse in science communication. And for that, I'm very happy that I'm joined by Lewis Hou, who's not only giving us insights, hopefully, on working in practice, but he's also having some research perspectives on this whole thing. But how does this all go together? Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience a bit about you and your projects, your work?
Thanks very much. Great to be here. Yep, my name is Lewis Hou. I run a science social enterprise that supports science communication, public engagement and cultural engagement across Scotland called Science Ceilidh. And we have a whole wealth of different work programs connecting communities with research and culture in the broader sense, but particularly within science communication, working with communities who are often underrepresented or very often marginalized. So we have programs, for example, which support youth workers to explore science communication with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. We have a New Scots program working with refugees that's funded at the moment to work around engineering in particular and looking at how science communication can support social justice and better integration and English learning and cultural exchange. And we also work particularly around health and well-being with different communities, for example, people who are unpaid carers, people who have dementia, for example, and even programs around supporting choirs and singers so they can actually explore more of the research about mental health as well. So quite a diverse range of programs, particularly focused on communities who are very often not in these conversations.
Yeah, so this is a really a whole lot of experience you're bringing to this session. Probably this is also the reason why I invited you and why I'm so happy that you joined us. But probably taking a step back from your perspective, why do you think it's important at all to work with all these communities? And you mentioned already a lot of them. Like, why do you want to engage with them and work with them and get them on the table?
I think, this is really important context. When I started in science communication back in 2009, I think, we were working with the more conventional science festivals. And actually one of the motivations of why I set up Science Ceilidh as an organization was recognizing that very often the types of families and the types of young people and adults we were working with were generally the already converted. And so actually, and this is borne out in the research even to this day. So for example, a lot of organizations have looked at trying to segment the population, for example, and in the UK, for example, generally speaking, we know that only about 25% of the population are either scientists themselves or actively engaged in science, which leaves 75% of the population who are not actively engaging. And I think it's something like 2% of the UK population go to science festivals. Now, of that 75%, 25% are kind of almost disinterested, then science is not for me, is how they identify. But that leaves us 50% of the population who are actually open to research, but they don't have the time or means or capacity necessarily to be actively engaging. But that leaves a really interesting opportunity. And I think it's a really interesting conversation, particularly we've seen the health inequalities, the research inequalities that exist with COVID, for example, in particular. But I think it's a really important thing for us to address within science communication, because I think one of the key provocations of our work is if we only preach to the converted, we only work with people with higher science capital or who are already interested in science, whilst on one level, of course, everyone deserves some talks and the culture, science as culture, but at the same time, you could also make the argument that that's only widening the gap, or at least certainly preserving the gap. If we're only serving the converted, that actually brings the ceiling higher. And so there's almost a kind of imperative for us to really acknowledge, well, who are we working with, and how can we make sure that we're working a bit more equitably, which might, in terms of the work that the listeners might be by thinking about in terms of the schools you visit, in terms of the communities you work with. Again, it's a really important provocation in terms of, well, how do we do that? And for us, we've been thinking about it in practice with a kind of 3-part model, which mostly makes sense, but it's really centered on how do we take a relationship-focused approach, or sometimes we might call it a people over program approach to doing science communication, of focusing on the relationships first and then building the engagement later on.
before I'm going to ask the very obvious questions, so why did you put the relationships at the center? You mentioned a science capital earlier, and for those watching this video who have done the first parts of this lesson, they already might know this concept or have read about it. But for those who just jumped into this video, can you probably in 2 or 3 sentences briefly say what this concept is about and why you think it's useful also in your practical context?
So science capital is it comes from a kind of a theoretical background, which is around cultural capital in particular. It's the idea that basically people's engagement and people's relationship and identity around science is formed by lots of different factors, and it changes over your life course. Now, sometimes people use science capital as in a quite it can be quite a deficit way. So what we mean by that is sometimes science capital is being used now in the sense of, this group of people have low science capital, which means that they don't, for example, they didn't grow up in a household which used science as part of the world, for example, didn't use different languages, didn't go to science museums, or didn't normalize science textbooks or books or stories or science TV shows. So but I think that's actually one of the, I wouldn't say the wrong way of using it, but I think it can be a problematic way of using it. I think where science capital is really interesting is it takes this broad sociological approach to understanding why people's relationship with science can be really complex. It's a complex interplay with your parents' attitudes, the attitudes that you grew up with, the opportunities that you did or didn't have, the types of role models that you might have seen, the types of more inner questions in terms of like, is this something that you want to be doing? Is this something for you? Are you welcome in? So it's kind of this broader concept around people's relationship and is science for you?
Excellent. So as always, we are also putting links to various papers and sources below. So you also find some more hints to the various aspects just mentioned. But now getting back to the very central part of the model. So you mentioned relationships are very crucial. So usually when people think about improving science communication, they're thinking about improving, okay, how can I explain it better? How can I make better slides, have it translate my complex science language? But you say it's about the relationship. So what does this mean and why?
Yeah, I think for us, relationships are really, really key. And I think part of that is based on a lot of the research behind science communication that exists. And I guess the first thing that's really important to say is, as you say, very often we think about how effective we are at communicating our message, but we also know from the research it's how you present and who presents the knowledge that matters. And again, I'm summarizing very, very kind of grossly massive fields of study that have lots of nuance, but generally speaking, what we know from the research, particularly in the age of misinformation and vaccine, skepticism or climate change skepticism, for example, is that authenticity is more important very often to people's mindsets than accuracy. And so that's obviously not necessarily mean that we have to pander, but it recognizes the fact that actually very often, when you do look at people who are particularly in emotionally charged subjects, for example, like climate change, like vaccinations, that actually just presenting facts does not change people's mindset. It really is more of the emotional sense of authenticity, and actually where relationships are so important is because you can build trust potentially, you can build understanding in a way that just more clearly communicating the facts is not going to change people's motivations, and it's not going to change people's minds. And actually, interestingly, research suggests that people can actually have a general high trust in science and still actually be very, very skeptical about different viewpoints when it comes to emotionally charged. So they're almost like special areas. And so when you're thinking about science communication, yes, of course, the clarity is important. But actually for us, it's about also thinking about, well, how do you show that authenticity? How do you show that you are trustworthy, you're worthy of trust? And how do you build those? And for us, it is on the ground, that translates to very often thinking about how you do multiple interventions and how you build trust over time. And for us, that has to be through relationships. There's no other way that you're going to reach particularly these kind of groups who aren't normally interested in science without a sense of being able to reach out and be where they are. I guess the second quick point I'll mention about that, and this links a little bit to science capital, is also not just authenticity is more important in some ways than accuracy, at least in terms of mindsets, but also the messenger can be more important than the message. So for a lot of researchers who might be watching, very often the motivation is sharing knowledge, but also getting young people or different communities inspired to take part in research, or potentially take, to do a STEM career, for example, and do STEM at university, and particularly with underrepresented groups. That's really, really important. But again, actually, a lot of the research, particularly from Science Capital work, the work of Emily Dawson, for example, the Aspires work that's happening in London, for example, suggests that the messenger and the role model aspect that we kind of mentioned beforehand is so important. So a good example of that, and probably the most well-studied, is understanding, for example, why girls very often don't go into physics. And it's not because they don't see physics as fun. And it's not because they're not good at physics, but it's actually because they don't necessarily see how physics relates to the kinds of jobs and values that they see. And they don't see physicists that look like them. And so it's a really important insight, because very often, again, when we think about science communication, it's about, oh, well, how do we make it more engaging? How do we make it more fun? When actually we know that in terms of long-term changing in aspirations, if that's what you're interested in, it is about who is doing the message, and how you build that relationship, how you change those minds. Well, you're probably not going to be able to do that in just one single intervention. So again, the importance of relationships is really, really important for us. And that's why it's the kind of bedrock of our model.
I guess we need to elaborate on that, but to span the whole picture first, can you briefly summarize what are the other components of the model? And then I would really like to look at the individual aspects, probably going on with relationships, since you already mentioned a lot about that.
So, I mean, for us, it's kind of a three-part model, and it's in many ways, it's just common sense. It's good community engagement, but it hopefully provokes a few questions for people watching and thinking about public engagement, thinking about science communication, in how you work with communities, and particularly with marginalized communities in particular. And I think there's an additional responsibility and to do that, because I think for a lot of marginalized communities, there are a lot of historical reasons and very valid reasons why they may not trust, or in science and in scientists and researchers in particular. So I think there's a certain duty of care about how we navigate these relationships and these projects. So the three steps are relationship building, which we'll build into a few different questions about how you might want to do that. The second one is about empowerment. So how can you, over the course of a project or multiple interventions or through a relationship, build more power, I guess it is, and examine the power relationship within that relationship, so you can hand over more and more of the decision making to the communities as you can, so it becomes much more of a co-production and co-development type project. And then at the very end, thinking very carefully about capacity. And so from our perspective, it's about from the very beginning, planning, well, how does this project end? And that's really, really important, because again, very often the assumption is that any engagement is better than none, but that's not strictly true. There is engagement that you can do which actually disempowers communities. And when you're working with communities that are underrepresented, I think it's even more important that we think about, well, actually, how do you end these projects well? You may have a limited capacity, your research is famously, you've got a lot going on, but I think it's important to think about, well, even as these things evolve, how do you signpost to other opportunities? How do you make sure that you're not reinventing the wheel? How do you make sure that these communities, especially once you've built trust, that you don't just disappear and that trust is actually lost, and that can actually be damaging?
So thanks a lot for summarizing this, and in lining out these three dimensions. You've raised a lot of questions, and I would really like to try to get to some answers. Of course, I do know that it's not possible to answer them in general, but maybe some approaches and what your experiences are from within the project. Is where we made this experience and this experience, and these might be different ways that work, or we experienced things that didn't work. And so the most obvious thing, and as I mentioned before, continuing, okay, relationship building is core, but how do you go about that? Like, do you have scientists in a lab and then their boss sends them out, okay, you spend now a day a week there and build a relationship with that community? Obviously that won't work for many reasons. So how do you approach that, and how would you recommend others to approach that?
Yeah. So, and as you've already hinted, these are just reflections. There is no, like all types of work around inclusive practice, it isn't a tick box type thing. So it's always about the mindset and kind of how you approach it and how you check, and it'll be unique for every single community you work with. I think the first thing from the very beginning actually is examining why you want to work with these communities. So I've given you some of the theoretical background as to why it might be important, but I think examining your own motivations is really, really important, and trying to be as honest as you can with that. So is it you as a researcher who wants to kind of target this group because you really need to make sure this group understands your research, or is it you as an individual who recognizes that these groups have been underrepresented, and actually that this is something the group that you're motivated to work with? And I think both of those have slightly different boundaries, and how you then manage expectations can be slightly different. Is it you as a researcher or you as an individual? I think the first thing is recognizing that, and then also recognizing that you as a researcher are also a member of community anyway. So again, sometimes for us particularly, it's about finding different ways of connecting on a human to human level, and that might not be as a researcher. In fact, personally, from our experience, generally speaking, if you come in only as a researcher being like, oh, look at all these amazing facts, or look at this amazing work, very often you're only going to be engaging with the already converted, and everyone else kind of turns off because they have a very limited view of what a researcher is. So it may be that you actually can connect with communities through different ways. It could be a more cultural way of connecting. It could be through your hobbies in arts or music or volunteering. These broader aspects can be actually a really interesting way of doing that. And again, there's a certain degree in which you might have to safeguard, well, are you there in a professional level or as a citizen? But I guess what I'm encouraging you to think about is why are they so separate, and actually can they be combined in a way that can provided a slightly different way of building connections, particularly with those who might not automatically think that research is going to be valuable to them. I guess the second question is, it does take time. So how much time are you willing to invest in that? And again, I appreciate that, when you are a full-time researcher, it can be difficult to do that. A cheat, and I think this is also probably just good practice anyway, is working out, well, who else is working with these communities and who has already spent time building that trust? Who are these intermediaries? Who are these organizations that do that? So, for example, in our projects, and all our projects are through partnerships, with refugees, for example, we're working very closely with people on the ground who've been working there for years and years and years to try and understand what place we can support in, and what is already being done. And I think that's really, really important to not reinvent the wheel there. And there's also a safeguarding element, in which case that expertise is so valuable. So it may be there are other, if you're working within a university, your university might have partnerships, for example, or you can look within what we call the third sector, so the charities, the non-profit organizations that are already working with these groups, or it could be other researchers, and seeing how you can add value to that. And it might not automatically be, well, we want to talk in your subject. It might be, actually we our young people, for example, are bored over the summers. Could you do something that's interesting? Or could it be, actually sometimes it's just about resources. Very often in some of our projects, it's about volunteering resource, or looking for old computers, for example, which very often universities have lots and lots of, and actually it's just those, and using that as a way. Well, that's what they need. So then, how do we provide that? So I think that's the kind of and then the last point to maybe mention, I guess, is and it sounds obvious, maybe, is around just being where they are. And again, is going to them and not expecting them to come into a university space, for example. And so I think that's a really important one, and one that can't be stressed enough, is that universities, buildings are barriers. Who buildings are for are very much, very often people don't feel like they're space that you can just knock on and you're automatically welcome to go into. So if you are working with communities, it may be spending a lot of time just seeing what their usual activities are and joining in and volunteering, getting to know them, and over time not putting your agenda onto them, but kind of over time building relationship, and then being able to find out how you can add value.
So thank you very much for these suggestions. For those people watching now, maybe if you have done the first parts of the lesson, you might recognize some of the exclusion factors, which is not a coincidence, Lewis and us, we also consulted in working this whole thing out. And of course, we don't reinvent the wheel when there's already a lot of experience there. So if you just joined for this video, make sure to check out the first lesson on this overview on exclusion factors. After this break, back to your model, actually. So there are two more aspects I would like to get your insights on. You say the second point, empowerment. So this is actually a step that maybe most of the scientists don't feel comfortable with, because they're used to explaining things and knowing things that, okay, still, okay, people need to know what I'm doing and then it's fine, but empowering to do what, like how to engage communities. Of course, like the classical way might be, okay, empower them to become scientists one day themselves. So, but then it's a very limited world model. So how do you go about that in your projects, and what's the understanding in your model you're using?
So I suppose there's two different elements to empowerment. The first one is quite literally in terms of decision making. So, very often in our work, we focus a lot on co-production, and co-production really is a scale. So you have, from one end, no co-production at all, you're doing to a community, and on the other end of it, you're doing with the community or by the community themselves. They're taking the lead. And in, you've got all these different kind of levels in between. There are lots of different models. We can share some of these ladders of participation, for example. But very often in public engagement, we kind of generally kind of go in the kind of like, either we don't consult and we just, give a talk, which is absolutely fine. That's not to say that that's bad. But I think particularly when we're trying to build relationships, it is about how you can build up so you can actually start consulting the communities a bit more and actually saying, well, actually, is this something you're interested in? What talk would you like us to talk about? You've got the more kind of tokenistic involvement, which is the sense of like, okay, they're involved in some bits, but not everything. But I think as you go up further the ladder, the communities are either get involved or actually generally more and more kind of taking the lead of the project. And again, you personally will know what's possible within your project. We as an independent organization have a lot more leeway in terms of letting communities lead. Whereas, for example, a good example is, yes, of course, you can potentially co-produce a project with the community, but given if your research is neuroscience or if it's computer science, you will probably be constrained that if it's to do with your job, ultimately you will have to work in these constraints around, well, there will have to be some neuroscience or computer science at some point. And that's fine. Like sometimes people think about this kind of spectrum thinking they automatically have to go to the top one, but actually that's not the case. I think it's about finding the right one for the community at the right time and for you as well. I mean, with all these partnerships, it has to work for you as well as the community too. The other element to think about that is co-production. Real co-production takes trust, so that loops back to the relationship building, and also it takes a lot of time. And we've really seen that in COVID in particular. So this isn't an excuse to only do to communities. But that said, there have been definitely situations where communities have said, we don't have the time. We just love you to do a really cool workshop or a really good talk. We don't want to get involved in the evaluation. We don't want to, so there are definitely situations where communities don't want to co-produce because they don't have the capacity. They don't have the time to do it. That said, there are plenty of times of how you can slowly build up that capacity so they can take more of the lead, especially if you're starting to think a bit more long term. But I suppose whether you're just giving a talk versus doing a series of workshops, there's always different elements that you can potentially ask communities how they can get more involved and how they can steer it, whether that's even planning the next talk or whether that's organizing the format and actually deciding what the format will work best for them. I mean, again, very often it just feels like common sense, but actually asking the question is so important. A really tricky one sometimes that we sometimes forget about is asking communities, well, what does success look like for them? What do they want to get out of these sessions? And it might be different from your motivations. And that, again, is okay, but it's about trying to have those conversations and be really frank about that. The second point, just around empowerment, is I suppose a lot of it is also acknowledging the expertise that communities have. And I think this is something that I kind of mentioned a little bit before, but very often we have to really challenge this idea that what's very often called the deficit model, that communities are these empty vessels waiting to be filled with knowledge, and if only they knew this knowledge, then their behaviors would change. And actually the behavioral aspect of it is almost, communities are empty and then they're also doing the wrong thing. So actually, again, coming back to Emily Dawson, this is often described as the double deficit model. And I think we have to really be very, very careful about this. You, of course, have expertise, but no one, and this is one of our key provocations, no one is an expert on anyone else's life. And we recognize this very often, increasingly in health sciences, for example, and where, very often for particular patient groups or particular conditions, we recognize that there's an expertise that patients themselves have that is so important to be embedded within the research process. And I think we need to think about that in broader research topics as well. Communities do have expertise. I've never met, sometimes this happens in culture as well. I've never met someone who's not cultural, So again, we have to challenge some of our assumptions. And I think kind of really recognize that we can learn from communities as well. And I think that's the almost converse part of the empowerment section, is that what can you learn from communities as much as communities learn from you? And I think when you start having those conversations and on that more equal footing, you can be surprised, but you end up with a much more equitable project.
If you're okay with that, I would like to ask a very provocative question back, since you just touched on one of the aspects. The health sciences and the current COVID pandemic has shown that there are several communities, and well, it's a question how these communities are defined, because it's not around social demographics, but let's say all these COVID deniers and the vaccination deniers, they also claim to have some sort of expertise, and of course they have expertise surrounding their life, maybe the circumstances that led them to believing these things and these very crazy things. But how do you deal with that when you're actually you want to empower them to make good health decisions for themselves, and so, then again acknowledging the existing expertise? So how do you deal with that? Do you have experience on that or opinions?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, or euro question, I feel. I think we're recognizing that I think we need to do more work about this dialogue, and I know that would be controversial for many. I think there is a tension in that if we give any platform to people who say that they're an expert because this is their lived experience, and obviously you can come up with lots of different, alternative medicines or different thought systems. And again, it's important that we acknowledge, for example, this comes into some of the dynamics around indigenous knowledges, for example, and how you reconcile that with more conventional Western medicine, for example, and how do you do that in a way that isn't, doesn't replicate these colonial sense of like, well, this is knowledge. There's a whole field of ethics around this, but so I don't have an easy answer. I think what I do know, as controversial as it is I do think it has to be dialogue. And and as much as you can criticize that as giving them a platform, we know very clearly that just telling them that they're wrong is also not going to make a difference, and actually will entrench them in their own belief systems. And I don't know if that is well, we know that's not a solution. So I do think there is more work to be done, and potentially a lot more research, and there is some research developing in how you try and incorporate dissenters, people who dissent from the mainstream ideas, and actually give them as much tools as possible to kind of explore this with you and take people with you. And they may still not disagree at the very end of the day. And I'm not sure how you reconcile that with public health. I think that's almost like a different level of discussion. But I do think, these relationships over time, this trust that's been built or mistrust, I do think we need to have more space for this, because I don't know if we have an alternative. I don't know. Okay, that's not an easy answer, but
totally. So I was really hoping maybe you have the answer to that, but to be honest, I didn't really expect it. It's a tough challenge, and I guess we need to work on that. But thanks for the suggestion. There are some very interesting points in that, and we try to also link some materials on that in the description below. But coming back to the last part of your model, so you build a relationship, you try to engage and empower the community, and then the last one, you already mentioned it briefly, capacity building. Like, how does this go on? Especially in academia, don't you have short-term projects? People are probably leaving after 3 or 4 years, but also community members, they might leave there if they're not a certain part of the community that's there forever and has time and is motivated over 10 years. But they're only very few. So how do you make this, continue?
Yeah. I mean, so like you've picked up, I think it's just about thinking from the very beginning. Very often these things emerge. So a really good example is when we set up our New Scots program with communities with diverse migration backgrounds, including particularly the Syrian refugee community, for example. We did a few very small one-off projects and programs of 3 or 4 kind of interventions, as it were, mostly volunteering, to be honest. And then what was nice about that was at the end of those interventions, we were working with all these different charities and different kind of church groups who are all trying to do these weekend activities for the refugees. And we asked the question, is there a steering group? Is there a group which helps organize this that also some of the Syrian refugees themselves are part of, so they can start directing, and coordinating? Because that's what we found. There's so much, maybe this is a good indictment for Edinburgh and Scotland, but there's so much goodwill that people kind of scheduling all these integration events and welcoming events, but they were also clashing. And so we posed the question, is there a steering group? And actually one of the kind of outcomes of our 3 intervention, small grant that we got from the British Science Association was that they set up a steering group just because we asked the question. Now, we take no credit for it apart from the fact that we posed the question, and that continued through volunteers. And again, we played a very small part in that. Now, we kind of helped support and very light touch for I think it was 3 years before a very, very specific ask came from the community, which was they recognized that a lot of the men had engineering backgrounds, had technical backgrounds, and they really struggled with finding learning English. There's lots of mental health issues for that, but they recognized that actually they weren't being recognized for the skills that they had, and so they were really interested in matching with potential local engineers to find out more about what's happening in Scotland, and actually with the kind of secondary aims around befriending and developing the technical level of English, particularly within a kind of technical field. So it was because there was no way that was going to emerge without the relationship, but it took 3 or 4 years before that very specific ask develops. So it can take a very, very long time, and that might be very unrealistic for some of the academics and researchers who might be listening. But I guess what we're trying to think about that is, well, how can you, in even small ways, end an intervention or a engagement or a talk in a way that leads to a yes and? It leads to something that's not just kind of a single hit, and not everyone will take it, but it could be as simple as signposting to other organizations, signposting to other science communicators, or people who do have that longer term funding that you can then kind of hook into to make sure that these things are more likely to have an effect, and it isn't just a kind of standalone parachuting in effect. Because again, we know from research these might be very nice, but they're not likely to going to change people's relationship with science or their views around science in the long term as well. So even if you don't have individual capacity, this probably hooks back into that kind of cheat I mentioned in the first part. This is why partnership is so important, because if you can't deliver the long-term stuff, there may be other organizations that can. And again, it's so important that you play a part within that longer-term story rather than you just doing it on a whim and then it having to die out because, as you say, you run out of capacity, which is completely natural, or actually, as you say, the community, the groups themselves, the individuals change, or there's a lot of flux. The pace of communities is very fast, and again, we've seen a lot of that, particularly in COVID. So even just in a small way, I think it's just about thinking, how does this end well? How does this end in a way that there's always an opportunity to follow up? And I think you can do that in any kind of intervention or engagement.
For a very last question, I would like to turn basically the whole thing upside down. I think you made a lot of very convincing arguments about putting the community, the relationship of the community in the center. For the last question, I would go back maybe to some degree to the traditional understanding, putting the scientists in the center. So when there are scientists here watching this video and thinking about how to work more inclusive, more equitable, more diverse in their science communication activities, are there any well, hints or tips or practical insights you could give them, like say, do this, or this is a very helpful way of approaching this, or I made very good experience with, small nitty gritty things they could do in their work, especially when they don't have a lot of experience themselves in working with other communities and all these aspects?
I think I'll go back to that main cheat. I think just don't do it alone. I think in all this type of stuff, it's about coming. It could be there are other science communicators or other people who are doing it with more capacity or more specialized skills or expertise in public engagement, or even just bigger funding which can support it. I think whilst I understand the motivation to just do something, and again, that can be really commendable, I think it's about trying to see the bigger picture in terms of how you fit into that. And again, it means that you don't have to feel like you have to reinvent everything yourself. You have to discover all these things. There is a robust research around science communication, and there's plenty of initiatives and opportunities to do that. And I think it's about, even if you've got a unique idea, trying to find out as best you can, in the same way that you would never do that if in a different research field. You would not just say, oh, I've got this idea, and without any academic kind of expertise, you would just say, okay, cool, I'm going to write a paper, or I'm going to do this study. You would look at what's out there already. And I think it's about having maybe that sense of humility around that, around doing science communication as well, and that will only help you in the sense of the model, in terms of how you do it, making sure you're not doing anything that might actually be in the long term potentially harmful, or certainly neutral, which is, you're doing it because you want to make a difference. So this is the best way. One of the best ways you can do it is by partnership with other organizations, with community organizations who can kind of help you do that. And then also it's efficient, because also very often it means that you can then tie into different networks, more volunteers or more people who can help work with you on a particular project, and potentially access different funding. And certainly one of the things I'll share with people is a link to 2 articles that I wrote. One is about how you find funding to make these bigger programs work, and how you can do that meaningfully, and then also what networks around science communication across the world globally exists, so you can link into this. And again, I suppose there's that sense of the classic saying, if you want to go somewhere fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go with others. And I think maybe that's my final message for people is you're not in this alone. You can do science communication with others. It's better when you do it with others. So yeah, thanks.
I now feel very, very bad, because this would have been excellent last words for this video, but I think I need to thank you. And so really, thanks again for joining me, and thanks again for sharing your thoughts. As mentioned, we put a lot of material and links, I guess, as a YouTube star down there or on the learning platform. And yeah, thanks a lot, and have a great evening.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks very much.